Mason Crawford's boots sank into the marshy edge of Paradise Valley as he froze mid-step. 20 yards ahead, the massive Anaconda's coils tightened around Daisy, the Williams prized brown Swiss cow. Her eyes bulged in silent agony, each labored breath growing shallower than the last. "Sweet Jesus," Mason whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. The snake, 16 feet if it was an inch, had wrapped itself 3 times around Daisy's midsection, its muscular body pulsing with each constriction. Mason's radio crackled. "Crawford here. I've got an emergency at the South Pasture wetlands. Anaconda's got one of Sarah's cows. She's got minutes, not hours." A strangled moo escaped Daisy's throat as the snake tightened again. Mason's blood ran cold. If her ribs crack, she's gone. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Mason's mind raced through his options as he inched closer to the struggling cow. Paradise Valley was no place for an anaconda. This beast belonged in South America, not Montana. The morning mist hung low over the marsh, giving the entire scene an otherworldly quality as sunlight filtered through the haze. "Easy, girl, easy," he murmured, though he knew Daisy was far beyond being calmed by words. The brown Swiss's chocolate-colored coat was darkened with sweat, her normally gentle eyes wide with primal terror. Mason had seen that same look before, in Afghanistan, when men realized they were about to die. 3 years in the Marines and 5 as a wildlife ranger hadn't prepared him for this particular emergency. He'd handled grizzly encounters, rescued hikers from mountain lions, even once separated 2 bull elk locked in combat. But an exotic constrictor in Montana backcountry was something else entirely. Mason edged forward, knife drawn. The snake's diamond-patterned head swiveled toward him, tongue flicking, assessing this new threat. He lunged, aiming to pin the head, but the anaconda was surprisingly quick. It released one coil only to tighten the others, and its powerful tail whipped around, catching Mason's ankle. He fell hard, splashing into 6 inches of murky water, the knife flying from his grip. "Damn it!" he hissed, scrambling to recover both his footing and his blade. A sharp pain lanced through his forearm. He'd gashed it on a submerged branch. Mason retreated a few steps, reassessing. Blood trickled down his arm as he pulled his radio again. "Sarah, it's Mason. I'm at the South Marsh. One of your cows, I think it's Daisy, she's caught by an anaconda. Big one. I need backup and something to pry those coils loose." Sarah Williams's voice crackled back almost immediately. "Daisy, are you sure? Tag number 42, brown with the white face marking. It's her." "God, not Daisy." "Mason, she's pregnant. Confirmed it last week. 2 months along." The stakes instantly doubled. Mason looked back at the struggling cow with new understanding. Not 1 life at stake, but 2. "How long?" Sarah's voice was tight with worry. 20, maybe 30 minutes before there's permanent damage. The snake's compressing her rib cage. She can barely breathe as it is. I'm coming, bringing the tranquilizer kit and the livestock pry bars." Mason holstered his radio, wrapping his bandana around his bleeding forearm. Time was a luxury Daisy didn't have. The anaconda's muscles rippled as it adjusted its grip, eliciting another weak moo from the struggling cow. "Hang on, Daisy," Mason whispered. "We're not giving up on you. Not today." Mason kept his eyes fixed on Daisy while memories washed over him like the spring floods that had first brought them together. 3 years earlier, he'd been just 6 months into his ranger position when the Paradise Valley experienced the worst flooding in 50 years. The Yellowstone River had burst its banks, transforming peaceful meadows into raging torrents. Sarah Williams' ranch had been hit particularly hard. Mason recalled the desperate call that had come over the emergency band. Sarah's voice, usually so composed, had cracked as she described how part of her herd was stranded on what had become a temporary island as waters continued to rise. By the time Mason arrived with the rescue team, the situation had grown dire. "We've got maybe an hour before that whole section goes under," the sheriff had said, gesturing toward a patch of higher ground where a dozen cattle huddled, water already lapping at their knees. Mason hadn't hesitated. Despite the dangerous current, he'd maneuvered the rescue boat across. That's when he'd first seen Daisy, not the full-grown cow she was now, but a terrified, days-old calf, separated from the herd, trapped in debris at the water's edge. "We don't have room for stragglers," one of the other rescuers had shouted over the roar of water. "Focus on the breeding stock." But something in the calf's eyes had reached Mason, a stubborn will to live that resonated with him. Without explaining himself, he'd waded into the chest-deep water, freed the calf from the debris, and carried her back to the boat, cradling her like a child. "She won't make it anyway," the same rescuer had muttered, but Mason had ignored him, wrapping the shivering calf in his own jacket. Sarah had been waiting at the shore, counting each animal as it was brought to safety. When she saw Mason with the calf, her face had transformed. Later, she told him that her late husband had named the calf Daisy on the day she was born, just 1 week before his heart attack. The calf represented his last contribution to the ranch he'd loved. "You didn't just save a cow that day," Sarah had told Mason weeks later when he'd stopped by to check on the ranch's recovery. "You saved a piece of my heart." That moment had marked the beginning of Mason's special connection with the Williams Ranch. Unlike other ranches in the valley, where he was viewed with the typical rural wariness reserved for government employees, at the Williams place, he was family. Sarah herself was no stranger to saving lives. Mason discovered this 6 months after the flood, during a routine visit. He'd noticed a familiar-looking photograph on her mantel, a military medical unit in Afghanistan. "You were there?" he'd asked, surprised. Sarah had nodded, her expression softening with recognition as pieces fell into place. "Combat veterinarian, attached to the 3rd Battalion, 2010 to 2013. Mason had stared at her in disbelief. "Kandahar, the convoy ambush. You were the vet who—" "Treated the service dogs," she'd finished, "and then helped with the human casualties when we ran out of medics." She'd studied his face. "You were one of the Marines, the one who carried his buddy 3 miles with a shrapnel wound in your own leg." The world was small indeed. The woman whose calf he'd saved had years earlier helped save his unit after an IED had taken out their lead vehicle. Life had a way of bringing people full circle. After that revelation, Mason had found himself visiting the Williams Ranch regularly. Something about the place, the rhythm of the days, the honest work, the animals who asked nothing but gave everything, helped quiet the memories that still sometimes woke him in the night. The flashbacks of firefights, the faces of friends lost, the constant hypervigilance that civilian life couldn't seem to erase. Daisy, in particular, seemed to sense when Mason's mind wandered to dark places. She'd been a precocious calf, following him around the barn as he helped Sarah with repairs. As she grew, she retained that unusual connection, often abandoning her grazing to amble over when he arrived, nudging his pockets for the treats he invariably brought. "Never seen anything like it," Sarah had commented once. "That cow thinks she's a dog. Or maybe she thinks you're another cow." Mason had laughed, but the truth was, Daisy's simple, unconditional recognition was more healing than all the therapy sessions the VA had provided. Around her, his breathing slowed, the knot in his chest loosened. The world narrowed to a manageable size. Not everyone appreciated Mason's dedication to the Williams Ranch, however. Hank Tucker, whose sprawling property bordered Sarah's more modest operation, had made his feelings clear the previous summer when Mason had caught Tucker's ranch hands moving fence posts to encroach on Williams' land. "You're a park ranger, Crawford, not a boundary commissioner," Tucker had sneered when confronted. "My family's been ranching this valley for 4 generations. We don't need government men telling us where our lines are." Mason had stood his ground, citing survey markers and property maps. "The law's the law, Tucker. Move the posts back by sundown, or I file a report." Tucker had complied, but not without a parting shot. "You and the widow better watch yourselves. This valley's changing. Small operations like hers are dying out. Matter of time before she sells to me anyway." The threat had lingered in the air throughout the fall and winter. Sarah had lost 2 cattle to mysterious illnesses. A section of her irrigation system had been damaged just as a dry spell hit. Nothing could be proven, but Mason had increased his patrols near the property line. Sarah never complained, but Mason knew the ranch was struggling. Her late husband's medical bills had left her cash poor, and without a family to help work the land, she relied heavily on part-time hands. Each animal was precious to her continued survival, and Daisy, with her newly confirmed pregnancy, represented the future of the herd. Now, watching the Anaconda's coils tighten around that future, Mason felt a cold fury building inside him. This was no accident. Anacondas weren't native to Montana. Someone had brought this creature here, and Mason had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who would have both the means and the motive to do so. The Williams herd was small but distinctive, primarily brown Swiss cattle known for their high milk production and gentle temperament. Sarah had built the herd carefully, focusing on quality over quantity. Daisy, with her perfect conformation and now her pregnancy, was literally the future of the ranch walking on 4 legs. Mason glanced at his watch. 10 minutes had passed already. In the distance he could hear the rumble of Sarah's truck approaching. He turned back to Daisy, whose struggles were growing weaker. "Don't you give up," he said firmly, as if the cow could understand him. "Sarah's coming. We're going to get you out of this." As if in response, Daisy's large brown eyes fixed on him, and she let out a low, plaintive moo that seemed to Mason to contain all the trust and fear a living creature could express. In that moment he made a silent promise, to her, to Sarah, and to himself. Whatever it took, Daisy would survive this day. Sarah's battered Ford F-150 skidded to a halt at the edge of the marsh, tires flinging mud in wide arcs. She jumped out, veterinary bag in one hand, metal livestock pry bars in the other. Her salt and pepper hair was hastily pulled back, her weathered face tight with worry. "How is she?" Sarah called, jogging toward Mason. "Holding on, but barely. Snake's gotten tighter in the last few minutes." Sarah assessed the situation with the clinical precision that came from decades of veterinary experience. "We need to get those coils loose without agitating the snake further. If it feels threatened, it'll constrict harder." She set down her equipment and pulled a tranquilizer kit from her bag. "I've got enough sedative here for a large predator, but I've never used it on a snake this size. I don't know how it'll react, or how long it'll take to work." Mason nodded grimly. "We don't have much choice. Daisy can't last much longer." While Sarah prepared the injection, Mason studied the Anaconda more carefully. Something about it struck him as odd. Wild constrictors typically tried to drag their prey to a secure location before consuming it. This one seemed content to stay in the open marsh, despite their presence. Sarah approached carefully with the loaded syringe attached to an extension pole. "Keep its attention on you," she instructed. Mason moved to the Anaconda's front, making himself visible while staying just out of striking range. The snake's unblinking eyes tracked him as Sarah inched around to its flank. With practiced precision, Sarah jabbed the syringe into the muscular body behind the head. The Anaconda reacted instantly, its coils tightening reflexively around Daisy, who let out a pitiful bellow. "Back up," Mason warned as the snake's head whipped around toward Sarah. She retreated quickly, putting distance between herself and the agitated reptile. "How long?" Mason asked, eyes fixed on Daisy's increasingly labored breathing. 5 minutes, maybe 10. It's a big animal." Those minutes stretched like hours. Mason kept talking to Daisy, his voice low and soothing, while Sarah monitored the snake for signs of the sedative taking effect. "There," Sarah finally said, pointing to the anaconda's head, which had begun to droop slightly. "It's working." They approached cautiously. The snake's movements were slower now, but it still maintained its grip on Daisy. Mason took one of the pry bars, positioning it carefully between a coil and Daisy's body. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded, taking up position with the second bar. "On three, 1, 2, 3. They leveraged their weight against the bars simultaneously. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, reluctantly, the coil began to loosen. Daisy's breathing became less labored as they managed to create a few inches of space. "Keep going," Sarah encouraged. They worked methodically, loosening one section at a time, careful not to harm either animal. As they pried the second coil loose, Mason noticed something unusual, a small, faded marking on the snake's scales. "Sarah, look at this." She leaned closer, squinting at the discolored patch. "Is that—" "A brand," Mason confirmed grimly. "Someone marked this snake. It's not wild. It's captive bred." Sarah's expression hardened. "Tucker. This has to be his doing. I heard rumors he was collecting exotic animals at that new facility he built." Mason had heard those rumors too, but had been unable to verify them during his official inspections. Tucker always seemed to know when authorities were coming and had everything in perfect order when they arrived. "Let's focus on Daisy first," he said. "We can deal with Tucker later." They returned to their task, working against time as the tranquilizer's effects deepened. The final coil was the most difficult, wrapped tightly around Daisy's midsection where her unborn calf was most vulnerable. "Careful," Sarah cautioned. "Too much pressure in the wrong direction could hurt the calf." Sweat dripped from Mason's forehead as he applied steady, controlled force to the pry bar. The anaconda's muscles were incredibly strong, even sedated. Inch by painful inch, they created space between the snake and Daisy's body. "Almost there," Mason encouraged, muscles trembling with exertion. Suddenly, Daisy let out a different sound, not pain but alarm. Her eyes were fixed on something behind them. Mason turned, expecting to see Tucker or one of his men. Instead, what he saw made his blood run cold. The rest of the Williams herd, nearly 30 head of cattle, was moving purposefully toward them from across the pasture. Leading them was Big Red, the massive bull whose protective nature was legendary in the valley. His head was lowered, powerful shoulders bunched, hooves churning the marshy ground. "Sarah," Mason said quietly, "don't make any sudden movements." She glanced over her shoulder, eyes widening. "What in God's name?" A charging herd of cattle was no small threat. A full-grown bull like Big Red could weigh over a ton, and those horns could gore a man with terrifying ease. Even the cows, if panicked or protective, could trample them to death. "They must smell the snake," Sarah whispered, "or Daisy's distress. We need to get out of their way." But leaving now would mean abandoning Daisy when they were so close to freeing her. Mason made a split-second decision. "Keep working on that last coil. I'll try to divert them." Sarah looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Mason, you can't stop a charging herd." "Trust me." Mason stepped away from Daisy and the snake, making himself visible to the approaching cattle. He raised his arms and called out in a firm, commanding voice, using the same tone that had once controlled military working dogs in Afghanistan. "Hey! Hey there! Easy now!" The herd showed no sign of slowing. Mason braced himself, aware of how foolish this attempt might be. Behind him, Sarah worked frantically to free the final coil from around Daisy. Big Red reached them first, his massive bulk moving with surprising speed. Mason stood his ground, though every instinct screamed for him to run. The bull slowed just yards away, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed not on Mason but on the scene behind him. Daisy, the snake, and Sarah. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of charging at them, Big Red moved to position himself between the humans and the outer marsh. The rest of the herd followed, spreading out in a semicircle. "Mason," Sarah called, her voice filled with wonder. "They're not attacking. They're protecting us." He turned to see that she was right. The cattle had formed a defensive perimeter, their bodies creating a living wall between the marsh, where potential threats might emerge, and the small group working to save Daisy. Big Red pawed the ground impatiently, as if urging them to continue their rescue efforts. Mason returned to Sarah's side, both of them processing this extraordinary development as they resumed work on the final coil. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah murmured. "It's like they understand exactly what's happening." With one final effort, they pried the last coil loose. Daisy immediately tried to stand, her legs wobbling with exhaustion and poor circulation. Sarah quickly examined her, running expert hands along her sides and belly. "Bruising, definitely. Maybe some cracked ribs, but I think she and the calf will be okay if we get her proper treatment right away." Mason nodded, relief washing over him. He turned his attention to the sedated Anaconda, which was now sluggishly trying to reorient itself. "We need to secure this snake. It's evidence." Sarah retrieved a livestock transport tarp from her truck. Together, they carefully maneuvered the drowsy reptile onto it. As they worked, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the protective herd, but by someone else. He scanned the tree line at the marsh's edge, catching a brief flash of movement. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we have company." She followed his gaze. "Tucker? Possibly. He'd want to see if his plan worked." Sarah's expression darkened. "This isn't the first time, Mason. Strange things have been happening all year. Missing cattle, damaged equipment, unexplained injuries to the herd. I thought it was just bad luck, but why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged, the gesture containing years of stubborn self-reliance. "No proof." "And you know how it is out here. Complaining without evidence just makes you look weak." Mason understood. In ranching communities like Paradise Valley, reputation was everything. Sarah, as a widow running a ranch alone, already faced skepticism from old-timers like Tucker, who believed women had no place managing land independently. "Well, now we have proof," Mason said, gesturing to the branded snake. "This is criminal endangerment minimum. Probably attempted destruction of property, too." They finished securing the Anaconda just as Daisy took her first unsteady steps. The rest of the herd, seeing her freed, began to move closer, Big Red leading the way. To Mason's amazement, several cows approached Daisy, gently nudging her, almost like they were checking on her condition. "I've never seen domestic cattle behave this way," Sarah said softly. "It's almost like they're a family," Mason finished. As they watched this remarkable display, a sharp crack echoed across the marsh, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking underfoot. The herd immediately tensed, heads swiveling toward the sound. Big Red let out a low, warning bellow. Someone was definitely watching them, and whoever it was, the herd considered them a threat. The cattle formed a tighter circle around Mason, Sarah, and the recovering Daisy. Big Red pawed the ground aggressively, his massive head swinging toward the tree line where the sound had originated. Mason had never seen domestic cattle exhibit such coordinated protective behavior. It was more like what you'd expect from wild buffalo or elephants. "Stay behind me," Mason told Sarah, moving cautiously toward the edge of the marsh. Before he could reach the tree line, a figure emerged. Hank Tucker, dressed in expensive ranch wear that showed no signs of actual ranch work. His weathered face was set in what he probably thought was a concerned expression, but Mason could see the calculation in his eyes. "Heard the commotion on the scanner," Tucker called, approaching with artificial casualness. "Sounded like trouble." Thought I'd see if you folks needed help." Mason positioned himself between Tucker and the sedated Anaconda. "That's mighty neighborly of you, Hank. Especially considering this trouble has your fingerprints all over it." Tucker's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "Don't know what you're talking about, Crawford. I just came to lend a hand." Sarah stepped forward, her voice cold. "Cut the act, Hank. We know the snake is yours. It's got your exotic animal operations brand on it." Tucker's gaze flicked to the unconscious reptile, and Mason didn't miss the flash of recognition before he masked it. "Lots of breeders use similar markings. Doesn't mean it's mine." "We'll let Fish and Wildlife make that determination," Mason replied. "I've already called it in." This was a bluff. He hadn't had time to call anyone yet, but Tucker wouldn't know that. The older man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Behind them, the cattle continued their protective formation, with several cows now attending to Daisy, who had managed to lie down in a more comfortable position. Big Red kept his attention fixed on Tucker, his massive horns gleaming in the morning light. "Your cattle are acting mighty strange," Tucker observed, clearly trying to change the subject. "Never seen anything like it." "They're protecting their own," Sarah replied proudly. "Something you wouldn't understand." Tucker's artificial pleasantness slipped for a moment. "What I understand, Sarah, is that small operations like yours are living on borrowed time. One bad season, one disaster, and you're finished. I've made you fair offers." "Fair?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Your last offer was half market value and you know it. You're just waiting for me to fail so you can swoop in and grab my water rights." Mason had suspected Tucker's motives all along. The Williams Ranch sat on crucial watershed terrain, controlling access to several natural springs that remain productive even in drought years. For Tucker's expanded operation, those water rights would be worth far more than the land itself. "Look around you, Sarah," Tucker gestured expansively. "This isn't sustainable. A widow running a ranch alone? It's not the natural order of things." Mason felt Sarah stiffen beside him. "The natural order changed a long time ago, Hank. Women run ranches, businesses, countries. Get used to it." Tucker's face reddened. "All I'm saying is—" "We know exactly what you're saying," Mason interrupted. "And we know what you're doing. Releasing an anaconda near Sarah's prize breeding cow isn't just nasty business. It's criminal." The rancher's hand moved subtly toward his jacket, and Mason tensed, wondering if he was carrying a weapon. But Tucker merely adjusted his collar, his weathered face settling into a mask of injured innocence. "That's a serious accusation, Ranger Crawford. I'd be careful making claims you can't back up." "The brand will back it up," Sarah replied. "And I've documented every accident that's happened on my property this past year. The irrigation system that was mysteriously damaged, I found boot prints that match your foreman's distinctive tread. The fence cuts that let my cattle wander onto BLM land where they could be impounded. I've got pictures of your truck nearby just hours before." Mason glanced at her in surprise. She hadn't shared any of this with him. "I may be a widow, Hank, but I wasn't born yesterday," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "I just needed one piece of evidence that couldn't be explained away. And now I have it." Tucker's facade cracked slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You've got nothing but a snake with a common breeder's mark and a bunch of coincidences. No judge in this county would side with you over me." "Maybe not," Mason agreed. "But the federal wildlife trafficking statutes don't care about local politics. Anacondas are regulated under the Lacey Act. Importing and transporting them across state lines without proper permits is a federal offense." This wasn't just a bluff. Mason knew the regulations well, and if this snake could be traced to Tucker's collection, the penalties would be severe. The standoff might have continued, but a low, pained moo from Daisy drew their attention. The cow was trying to stand again, struggling against her injuries. The rest of the herd grew visibly agitated, with several animals moving closer to her, offering their bodies as support. "She needs medical attention," Sarah said urgently, professional concern overriding the confrontation with Tucker. "We need to get her back to the barn." Mason nodded, not taking his eyes off Tucker. "You're free to leave, Hank, but don't go far. The authorities will have questions." Tucker's jaw worked as he considered his options. Finally, he offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Always happy to cooperate with the authorities." "But this isn't over, Sarah. One way or another, that land will be mine." "Not today," she replied firmly, "and not tomorrow either." As Tucker retreated to his vehicle, the herd visibly relaxed, though Big Red maintained his vigilant stance until the sound of Tucker's engine faded into the distance. Sarah immediately turned her attention to Daisy, kneeling beside the injured cow. "Her breathing is still labored. I'm worried about internal injuries affecting the pregnancy." Mason joined her, gently running his hand along Daisy's side. The cow's eyes found his, and he was struck again by the intelligence and trust he saw there. "We need to move her," he said. "Can we get the trailer close enough?" Sarah looked at the marshy ground dubiously. "Not without risking getting stuck. We'd need to guide her to firmer ground first." As if understanding their dilemma, the herd began to move. Two of the larger cows positioned themselves on either side of Daisy, providing support as she struggled to her feet. Big Red moved to the front, clearing a path through the softest parts of the marsh. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah whispered, watching in amazement as the cattle coordinated their efforts. "It's like they're working together to help her." "They are," Mason replied softly. "They understand exactly what's happening." The impromptu procession moved slowly toward firmer ground, with Mason and Sarah following close behind. Daisy leaned heavily against her herd mates, her steps unsteady but determined. Behind them, the sedated Anaconda remained secured on the tarp, its massive body occasionally twitching as the tranquilizer began to wear off. "I need to call this in," Mason said, pulling out his radio. "Get Fish and Wildlife out here to collect the snake, and the sheriff to document everything." Sarah nodded, her attention still focused on Daisy's labored progress. "Do you think they'll be able to prove Tucker was behind this?" "The brand is compelling evidence. If they can match it to other animals in his collection, that's a solid connection. And if any of his workers talk—" "They won't," Sarah said with certainty. "Tucker pays too well, and most of his hands aren't exactly local. I doubt half of them have proper documentation." Mason knew she was right. Tucker's operation had grown increasingly secretive over the past year, with unfamiliar faces coming and going at odd hours. The old-time ranch hands who'd worked the property for generations had been gradually replaced with men who kept to themselves and avoided town. They reached the edge of the marsh where the ground became solid enough to support vehicles. Sarah headed for her truck to bring it closer, while Mason stayed with Daisy and the herd. The remarkable behavior of the cattle continued. They maintained their protective formation around Daisy, with different animals taking turns supporting her weight. Mason observed with growing amazement as they communicated through subtle movements and soft vocalizations. When Sarah returned with the truck and livestock trailer, the herd parted to create a path directly to the ramp. Two larger cows stayed with Daisy, helping her navigate the incline with surprising gentleness. "It's almost like they've done this before," Sarah said as she watched. "Maybe they have," Mason replied. "We just never noticed." Once Daisy was secured in the trailer, Mason expected the rest of the herd to return to grazing. Instead, they gathered around the vehicle, some pressing their faces against the trailer's ventilation openings, others standing at alert as if still on guard duty. "They're not leaving her," Sarah observed, voice thick with emotion. "No," Mason agreed. "They're not." As Sarah prepared to drive Daisy back to the ranch, Mason radioed in the situation, requesting both wildlife officers for the snake and sheriff's deputies to document the scene. He explained the evidence connecting the anaconda to Tucker's exotic animal collection, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the attack. "I'll stay here with the snake until backup arrives," he told Sarah. "You get Daisy back and start treatment." She hesitated. "What about Tucker? If he was willing to do this, he might try something else when he realizes his plan failed." Mason considered this. She wasn't wrong. Tucker had shown he was willing to cross serious lines to get what he wanted. "I'll have the sheriff send a deputy to the ranch as a precaution." Sarah nodded gratefully, then surprised him by pulling him into a quick, fierce hug. "Thank you, Mason. Not just for today." He understood what she meant. For standing with her against Tucker's pressure. For being one of the few people in the valley who respected a woman running a ranch on her own terms. "What are friends for?" he replied simply. As Sarah drove away with Daisy, the rest of the herd did something even more remarkable. They split into two groups. Most followed the trailer, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly intent on staying with their injured herdmate. A smaller contingent, led by Big Red, remained with Mason and the captured snake. Mason sat on a fallen log, keeping an eye on the still sedated Anaconda while waiting for backup. Big Red stood nearby, his massive presence oddly comforting. The bull occasionally snorted or pawed the ground, but made no move to leave. "You're quite the leader, aren't you?" Mason said conversationally to the bull. "Taking care of your family." Big Red's ears flicked forward, as if he were actually listening. Mason found himself continuing to talk, the one-sided conversation strangely therapeutic. "You know, I never expected to find this kind of connection out here. After Afghanistan, I didn't think I'd trust anything again. Not people, not institutions, nothing." The bull's steady gaze remained fixed on him. "But there's something honest about this place, about all of you." Mason gestured to the cattle. "No hidden agendas, no politics, just living according to your nature." As the morning sun climbed higher, Mason reflected on the extraordinary events he'd witnessed. Something profound had happened here. Something that challenged his understanding of these animals he'd worked around for years without truly seeing. The cattle hadn't just demonstrated herd protection instincts. They'd shown problem-solving, cooperation, and what could only be described as compassion. They'd recognized Daisy's distress, understood that Mason and Sarah were helping rather than threatening, and organized themselves to assist in the rescue. In his years as a ranger, Mason had developed a healthy respect for wildlife. But he'd always maintained the mental separation that humans typically draw between themselves and domesticated animals, especially livestock. Today had erased that line. The intelligence and emotional awareness he'd witnessed couldn't be explained away by simple instinct. These animals had revealed themselves as individuals with complex inner lives, beings worthy of moral consideration beyond their utility to humans. As sirens sounded in the distance, announcing the arrival of backup, Mason made a silent promise to himself, to Sarah, and to the watchful bull standing guard beside him. Things would be different from now on. Tucker's threat against the Williams Ranch wasn't just an attack on Sarah's livelihood. It was an assault on this remarkable family of beings who had demonstrated more loyalty and cooperation than most humans Mason had known. And he would do whatever it took to protect them. The sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed closely by 2 officers from Fish and Wildlife. Mason explained the situation while they documented the scene and carefully transferred the still sedated Anaconda into a specialized transport container. Big Red and his small contingent of cattle maintained their vigilant presence throughout the process, drawing curious glances from the officials. "Never seen cattle act like this," commented Sheriff Donovan, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement in the county. "Like they're standing guard." "That's exactly what they're doing," Mason replied. "You should have seen them earlier. They formed a protective circle around us while we were freeing Daisy." Donovan shook his head in amazement. Speaking of which, I sent Deputy Collins over to the Williams place to keep an eye out. How's the cow doing? Sarah thinks she'll recover. She's worried about the calf, though. The mention of the pregnant cow added another dimension to the case against Tucker. Threatening livestock was serious enough in ranching country, but endangering a breeding animal carrying an unborn calf would be viewed particularly harshly by the local community. "We'll need your statement, and Sarah's," Donovan said. "And I want to see this brand you mentioned." One of the Fish and Wildlife officers called them over to where they'd secured the Anaconda. "Found the mark," she said, pointing to a distinct pattern on the scales. "It's partially healed over, but that's definitely a deliberate brand. Looks like a stylized T inside a circle." Mason nodded. "Tucker's brand for his exotic collection. I've heard rumors about it, but never seen it confirmed until now." "We'll need a warrant to inspect his facilities," the officer replied. "This is enough probable cause, especially with the proximity to the Williams property." As they finished processing the scene, Mason's radio crackled to life. Sarah's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Mason, are you there? We've got a situation at the ranch." He responded immediately. "What's happening?" "Daisy's in distress. I think she might be going into premature labor from the trauma. And Tucker just drove by, real slow. Deputy Collins is watching him, but I don't like it." Mason exchanged glances with Sheriff Donovan, who nodded. "We're on our way. Hang tight." As they prepared to leave, Mason turned to Big Red and the other cattle. "You should head back to the ranch," he said, feeling slightly foolish for talking directly to them, but unable to shake the sense that they understood. To his amazement, the small herd immediately began moving in the direction of the Williams Ranch, with Big Red leading the way at a purposeful pace. "Well, I'll be damned," Donovan muttered. Mason rode with the sheriff, his mind racing with concern for Daisy and the unborn calf. He found himself remembering another emergency, years ago and half a world away in Afghanistan. The memory surfaced with surprising clarity as they sped toward the Williams Ranch. It had been during his second deployment. Their unit had been conducting a routine patrol when an IED hidden in a culvert detonated beneath their lead vehicle. The explosion had flipped the armored Humvee, trapping Staff Sergeant Miller inside the crushed metal frame. Mason had been in the second vehicle. Despite the risk of secondary devices, a common Taliban tactic, he'd immediately rushed to help, crawling into the twisted wreckage while others provided security. "I'm stuck, Crawford," Miller had gasped, his lower body pinned beneath the collapsed dashboard. "Can't feel my legs." The smell of fuel and burning rubber had filled the air as Mason worked to free him. "Hang on, Sarge. We're getting you out." "The radio," Miller had insisted, his face ashen with shock and pain. "Need to warn the others. There's a spotter on the ridge." Even trapped and injured, Miller's first thought had been for his team. It was that same selfless instinct Mason had witnessed today in the cattle. That drive to protect one's own even at personal cost. With the help of 2 other Marines, Mason had eventually freed Miller, carrying him to safety moments before the Humvee erupted in flames. Later, at the field hospital, he'd encountered Sarah Williams for the first time, though he hadn't known her name then, just the efficient veterinarian who'd been pressed into service treating human casualties when the medical tent was overwhelmed. "Your friend will keep his legs," she'd told Mason after stabilizing Miller. "You got him out just in time." Mason had nodded, too exhausted to speak, his own shrapnel wound throbbing despite the morphine. "That was brave," she'd added, checking his dressing. "Going in like that when there could have been secondary devices." He'd shrugged. "He'd have done the same for me." Sheriff Donovan's voice pulled Mason back to the present. "We're here." The Williams Ranch came into view. A modest collection of well-maintained buildings nestled against the backdrop of the Absaroka Mountains. The main house, A century-old farmstead that Sarah had lovingly restored stood adjacent to a large red barn and several outbuildings. Pastures stretched in 3 directions, bordered by split-rail fencing. They found Sarah in the barn, kneeling beside Daisy in a large stall filled with fresh straw. The cow was lying on her side, breathing heavily, her sides heaving with obvious distress. Deputy Collins stood nearby while the majority of the herd had gathered outside the barn, their faces visible through the open doors and windows. "How is she?" Mason asked, dropping to his knees beside Sarah. "Not good," Sarah replied, her veterinary calm masking the emotional turmoil Mason could see in her eyes. The pressure from the constriction caused placental abruption. "She's in labor 2 months early." Mason laid a gentle hand on Daisy's neck. The cow's eyes found his, filled with pain and something that looked remarkably like fear. "Can you stop it?" Sarah shook her head. "Too late. The calf is coming, ready or not." She gestured to a collection of medical supplies she'd assembled. "I'm preparing for an emergency delivery, but at this gestational age..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. A calf born this prematurely had poor chances of survival. "What can I do?" Mason asked. "Help me keep her calm. Talk to her. She responds to your voice." Mason positioned himself near Daisy's head, stroking her neck and speaking in low, soothing tones while Sarah monitored the progression of labor. Outside, the cattle had grown increasingly restless, their soft lowing creating a backdrop of concern. Sheriff Donovan approached after conferring with Deputy Collins. "Tucker's vehicle passed by twice more in the last half hour. Collins says he's just driving back and forth on the county road, watching the place." "Psychological warfare," Sarah muttered without looking up from her work. "He wants me on edge." "I've got 2 more deputies on the way," Donovan assured her. "And I've called Judge Harmon for an emergency warrant to search Tucker's exotic animal facility based on the evidence we found at the marsh." Mason nodded gratefully, then returned his attention to Daisy, who had begun to strain in earnest. Her powerful body trembled with the effort, soft bellows of pain escaping her. "That's it, girl," Sarah encouraged, her hands expertly checking the birth canal. "I can feel the calf now." "Front hooves first, that's good." The next 20 minutes were intense, with Sarah guiding the premature delivery, while Mason kept Daisy as comfortable as possible. Finally, with a rush of fluid, the tiny calf emerged. Much smaller than a full-term newborn, with spindly legs and a fragile-looking chest that barely moved with shallow breaths. Sarah immediately went to work, clearing fluid from the calf's nose and mouth, then rubbing it vigorously with clean towels to stimulate circulation and breathing. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "Fight." Daisy strained to see her calf, attempting to rise despite her exhaustion and injuries. Mason helped position the newborn where its mother could reach it, watching as Daisy began licking the calf with gentle, encouraging strokes of her tongue. "Is it?" Mason couldn't bring himself to finish the question. "Too soon to tell," Sarah replied, her focus unwavering as she continued emergency care. "The lungs aren't fully developed. We need to get antibiotics on board and keep it warm." Outside, the cattle had grown silent, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the normally restless Big Red stood motionless at the barn entrance, his massive head low as he watched the drama unfold. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tense silence. Sheriff Donovan stepped outside, then returned moments later with a concerned expression. "Tucker's here," he announced, "with his lawyer and 3 of his hands." Sarah looked up sharply. "What does he want?" "Says he wants to talk. Claims he has documentation proving the Anaconda isn't his." Mason exchanged glances with Sarah, whose face had hardened into determined lines. "I need to stay with Daisy and the calf," she said. "Mason? I'll handle it," he assured her, giving Daisy one final stroke before rising to his feet. To Sheriff Donovan he added, Keep your deputies close." Outside, the confrontation was already taking shape. Hank Tucker stood beside his luxury pickup, flanked by his attorney, an expensively dressed woman from Bozeman, and three ranch hands whose hard expressions suggested they weren't there just for moral support. On the other side of the yard, Deputy Collins and the newly arrived deputies maintained a watchful presence. Most remarkably, the cattle had positioned themselves between Tucker's group and the barn, with Big Red at the center of the formation, his horns lowered in unmistakable warning. "Control your livestock, Sarah," Tucker called, his voice carrying across the yard, "before someone gets hurt." "They're behind a fence on private property," Mason replied, stepping forward. "If anyone's at risk of getting hurt, it's trespassers." Tucker's attorney spoke up. "We're here to resolve this misunderstanding amicably, Ranger Crawford. My client has documentation proving the snake in question was not from his collection." "Convenient," Mason commented. "Let me guess. Paperwork showing he sold it months ago or never owned that particular specimen?" The attorney's tight smile confirmed his suspicion. "My client maintains his innocence and is prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation. However, these unfounded accusations are damaging to his reputation and business interests." Sheriff Donovan joined them, his weathered face impassive. "We have a warrant being processed right now to search Mr. Tucker's exotic animal facilities. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to worry about." Tucker's face flushed with anger, but his attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm. "We'll comply with any legally obtained warrant, of course. But I must insist that these public accusations cease immediately." The standoff might have continued, but a commotion from the barn drew everyone's attention. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "Mason, the calf is struggling to breathe." Without hesitation, Mason turned his back on Tucker and hurried to the barn. Behind him he heard Tucker's derisive voice. "All this fuss over a damn cow. This is a business, not a petting zoo." Inside, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The premature calf lay trembling on the straw, its breathing shallow and labored. Daisy had managed to rise to her feet despite her injuries and stood protectively over her offspring, distress evident in every line of her powerful body. "The lungs aren't mature enough," Sarah explained, her hands moving swiftly as she prepared an injection. "I'm giving surfactant to help, but without a ventilator." She didn't need to finish. They both knew the remote ranch didn't have the sophisticated medical equipment that might save the struggling calf. "What about Bozeman?" Mason asked, referring to the veterinary hospital at Montana State University, just over an hour's drive away. "Maybe, if we can stabilize it enough for transport," Sarah replied, though her tone suggested the chances were slim. As they worked frantically to save the tiny life, Mason became aware of movement behind them. Several of the cattle had entered the barn, ignoring the normal boundaries they respected. Led by Big Red, they formed a semicircle around Daisy and her calf, their presence oddly calming despite the cramped space. "They're coming inside now?" Sheriff Donovan asked from the doorway, his voice reflecting amazement rather than concern. "Let them be," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "They're family." Outside, Tucker's voice rose in argument with the deputies. The confrontation was escalating, but inside the barn, a different kind of drama commanded all attention. The struggle of a new life to survive against overwhelming odds, and the collective will of the herd to protect their own. In that moment, watching the gentle giants gather around their fallen comrade, Mason felt the last of his emotional barriers dissolve. These weren't just livestock, economic units to be tallied on a balance sheet. They were beings with inner lives as rich and complex as any he had encountered, perhaps more so than some humans he had known. And if a creature like Daisy could show such devotion to her calf, such trust in humans who had earned it, and inspire such loyalty from her herd, then she deserved every effort to save what she cherished most. "Fight," Mason whispered to the struggling calf. "Your mama's not giving up." And neither are we. The premature calf's struggle for life created a bubble of intense focus within the barn, isolating Mason and Sarah from the confrontation unfolding outside. They worked in synchronized silence, their hands steady despite the pressure, communicating through glances and brief nods as they fought to stabilize the fragile newborn. "Oxygen levels are still dropping," Sarah murmured, checking a small portable monitor she'd clipped to the calf's ear. "We need to intubate." Mason handed her the equipment from the emergency veterinary kit. During his time at the Williams Ranch, he'd assisted Sarah often enough to anticipate her needs, learning the basics of veterinary first aid through observation and her patient teaching. "Hold the head steady," she instructed, positioning the endotracheal tube. "Gentle now." The calf's eyes were wide with panic, its tiny body trembling as it struggled for each breath. Daisy stood nearby, occasionally leaning down to lick her offspring with gentle, encouraging strokes of her tongue. The other cattle maintained their protective circle, their massive bodies creating a living wall between the vulnerable pair and the world outside. As Sarah finished securing the breathing tube, a commotion erupted from the yard. Raised voices, the slam of a truck door, then Sheriff Donovan's authoritative command, "Lower that weapon right now." Mason's head snapped up. "Stay with them," he told Sarah, already moving toward the barn door. The scene outside had deteriorated rapidly. One of Tucker's ranch hands had a rifle half raised, while the deputies had drawn their service weapons in response. Tucker himself stood behind his men, his face flushed with anger while his attorney frantically tried to de-escalate the situation. "This is private property," Tucker was shouting. "We have every right to protect ourselves from dangerous animals. Those cattle are behind fencing on Williams' land," Sheriff Donovan replied, his voice steady despite the tension. "Lower the weapon now, or you're going to jail." Mason stepped out of the barn, deliberately placing himself between Tucker's group and the building where Daisy and her calf fought for survival. "What's happening here, Sheriff?" Donovan kept his eyes on the armed ranch hand. "Mr. Tucker claims he feels threatened by the cattle and wants them moved away from the fence line. When I explained that wasn't going to happen, his man here decided to take matters into his own hands." The ranch hand. A wiry man Mason didn't recognize from the valley, still hadn't lowered his rifle completely. His eyes held the flat, emotionless quality Mason had seen too often in combat zones, the look of someone who viewed violence as simply another tool. "You need to put that down," Mason said quietly, addressing the man directly. "No one's threatening you." "Those ain't normal cattle," the man replied, his accent suggesting somewhere farther south. "Been watching 'em. Way they move, way they look at you. Ain't natural." Tucker cut in. "My men have a right to defend themselves, Crawford. Those animals are acting aggressively." "They're protecting their herd mate," Mason countered. "The one that nearly died because of your Anaconda." "You can't prove that snake is mine," Tucker snapped, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "The warrant just came through," Donovan announced, holding up his phone. "Deputies are on their way to your exotic animal facility right now, Tucker. So I suggest you and your people stand down and let this play out legally." A tense silence followed as Tucker conferred quietly with his attorney. The ranch hand still hadn't fully lowered his weapon, his eyes now fixed on Big Red, who had moved to the fence line, massive head lowered, clearly aware of the threat. "I need everyone to calm down," Donovan continued, his voice level but authoritative. "Tucker, your men need to secure that weapon and return to your vehicle. You can make your case when we have all the facts." The standoff might have resolved peacefully, if not for the ill-timed arrival of a fish and wildlife vehicle, its sudden appearance and the crunch of gravel sending a ripple of tension through the already charged atmosphere. The ranch hand swung his rifle toward the new arrival, and in that moment two things happened simultaneously. Deputy Collins shouted a final warning, and Big Red charged the fence, The wooden rails, sturdy as they were no match for 1,500 pounds of determined bull. They splintered with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, sending everyone diving for cover. Big Red burst through the broken fence, followed by several other cattle, creating chaos in the yard. Mason's military training took over. He tackled the armed ranch hand as the man swung the rifle toward Big Red, both of them hitting the ground hard. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as Mason wrenched it from the man's grasp. "Stay down," he ordered, securing the rifle while Deputy Collins rushed to assist. Around them, the cattle moved with surprising precision, not randomly charging but strategically positioning themselves between the perceived threats and the barn. Big Red stood his ground, snorting clouds of steam in the cool morning air, while the others formed a protective semicircle behind him. Tucker had retreated to his truck, his face a mask of outrage and fear. "You see this?" he shouted to no one in particular. "Dangerous animals. They should be put down." Sheriff Donovan had maintained his composure throughout the chaos, his service weapon still holstered as he assessed the situation. "Everyone stay calm," he commanded. "No sudden movements." The Fish and Wildlife officers remained in their vehicle, wisely choosing not to add more unpredictability to the volatile scene. Mason handed the ranch hand's rifle to Deputy Collins, then slowly rose to his feet, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Big Red," he called, addressing the bull directly. "Easy now." To the amazement of everyone present, except perhaps Mason himself, the massive animal responded to his voice. The aggressive posture relaxed slightly, though the vigilant attention remained fixed on Tucker and his men. "They understand you?" Sheriff Donovan asked quietly, genuine wonder in his voice. "They understand a lot more than we've given them credit for," Mason replied. A sound from the barn drew their attention. Sarah emerged, her expression a complex mixture of urgency and hope. "Mason, the calf is stabilizing, but we need to get it to Bozeman. The University Hospital has a neonatal intensive care unit for livestock." The tension of the standoff was immediately replaced by a new urgency. Mason turned to Donovan. "Sheriff, can you handle this situation? I need to help Sarah transport the calf." Donovan nodded. "Go. We've got backup arriving, and these gentlemen," he gestured to Tucker and his group, "were just leaving." Tucker's attorney, recognizing the deteriorating legal position, was already urging her client back into his vehicle. "This isn't over," Tucker called as he reluctantly complied. "Those animals are dangerous, and that woman can't control them." Mason ignored him, already moving back toward the barn where Sarah was preparing the fragile calf for transport. "What do you need?" he asked. "I've stabilized it for now, but we need to move fast. The portable oxygen will only last about 40 minutes, and it's an hour to Bozeman." Together, they carefully transferred the tiny calf onto a transport stretcher. Daisy watched anxiously, attempting to follow despite her own injuries, letting out distressed sounds when Sarah began moving her calf toward the door. "She won't let us take it without her," Sarah realized, "and she's in no condition to travel." Mason knelt beside Daisy, placing a gentle hand on her neck. "We need to help your baby," he said softly. "You need to trust us." The cow's large brown eyes seemed to search his face, and for a moment Mason felt the weight of her intelligence, her understanding, as a tangible thing. Then remarkably she backed away slightly, giving them space to move the calf. Outside, the situation had calmed somewhat. Tucker and his men had retreated to their vehicles under Donovan's supervision, though they remained parked at the edge of the property. The cattle that had broken through the fence were being gently guided back by Deputy Collins, who had wisely borrowed a bucket of feed from the barn to entice them. Big Red, however, remained stationed near Sarah's truck, as if he understood their urgent need to transport the calf. The bull's massive presence had kept Tucker and his men at a respectful distance, creating a buffer zone that allowed Mason and Sarah to focus on their emergency preparations. "We need to go now," Sarah said, checking the oxygen levels on the portable tank. "Can you drive? I need to monitor the calf." Mason nodded, helping her secure the transport stretcher in the back seat of her truck. The tiny calf lay frighteningly still, its only signs of life the shallow rise and fall of its chest and the occasional flicker of its ears. "Sheriff," Mason called to Donovan, "we're heading to Bozeman. Can you have someone stay with Daisy? She's still recovering from her injuries, and I don't trust Tucker to stay away once we're gone." Donovan nodded. "Collins will stay, and I'll send another deputy when shift change comes. Go save that calf." As Mason started the engine, he glanced back at the barn where Daisy stood in the doorway, her posture communicating both concern and resignation. Around her, the herd had regrouped, several cows standing close as if offering comfort. "They know," Sarah said softly, following his gaze. "They understand exactly what's happening." The drive to Bozeman was the longest hour of Mason's life. He pushed the truck as fast as he dared on the winding mountain roads, while Sarah monitored the calf's vital signs from the back seat, occasionally administering additional medication through an IV line she'd established. "Oxygen's dropping again," she reported 20 minutes into the journey, her voice tense. "The tube must be getting obstructed." Mason watched in the rear-view mirror as she performed a delicate adjustment, her hands steady despite the vehicle's movement. "Better?" "For now," she replied, though her expression remained grave. "Mason, I don't know if we're going to make it in time." He pressed the accelerator harder, taking a curve fast enough to make the tires protest. "We will." As they approached Bozeman, Sarah called ahead to the veterinary hospital, ensuring a team would be ready when they arrived. Mason navigated through the town's morning traffic with single-minded focus, grateful that most commuters seemed to recognize the emergency vehicle lights Sarah had attached to the truck's roof. The Montana State University Veterinary Complex came into view, a modern facility that served as both teaching hospital and research center. A team in scrubs waited at the emergency entrance, ready to take charge of their fragile passenger. What followed was a blur of activity as the calf was rushed into intensive care. Mason and Sarah found themselves relegated to a waiting area, suddenly without purpose after the adrenaline-fueled rush of the past hours. "You should clean that up," Sarah said, nodding toward Mason's arm where his earlier cut had reopened during the confrontation with Tucker's ranch hand. He glanced down, surprised to see blood seeping through his sleeve. "Forgot about it." A young veterinary student provided first aid supplies, and Sarah cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency. Her hands were gentle but firm, reminding Mason of that long-ago field hospital in Afghanistan where they'd first crossed paths without knowing it. "Thank you," he said simply when she finished. "Not just for this, for everything back there. Most people wouldn't have gone to such lengths." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "They're not just livestock to me, Mason. They never have been. Each one is an individual with their own personality, their own spirit, I guess you could say." "I saw that today," he admitted. "With the herd protecting Daisy and then us. That wasn't just instinct. They were making choices." She nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "People in agriculture don't like to think too deeply about that. It makes the business end of ranching too complicated, morally speaking. But I've always known they were more than we gave them credit for." "Tucker called your place a petting zoo," Mason recalled. "Like caring about their well-being was somehow unprofessional." "Tucker represents the worst of the industry," Sarah replied, her voice hardening slightly. "To him, animals are units of production, nothing more. That attitude is how we ended up with factory farms and all the cruelty that goes with them." Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a veterinarian in surgical scrubs. Both stood immediately, bracing for news. "Dr. Williams." I'm Dr. Chen, neonatal specialist. The young woman's expression was cautiously optimistic. We've got the calf stabilized and on a ventilator. The surfactant therapy you started was exactly right. Without it, we'd be having a very different conversation. Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. So there's hope? Guarded optimism, Dr. Chen replied. The next 24 hours will be critical. The lung development is consistent with around 7 months gestation, which gives us a fighting chance. We've got him on antibiotics as a precaution against pneumonia, which is the biggest risk at this stage. Him? Mason asked, realizing they hadn't even checked the calf's gender in the rush to save its life. Dr. Chen nodded. A bull calf. Small but feisty. He tried to kick me during the examination. Despite everything, Sarah laughed. Sounds like he's got his mother's spirit. Speaking of which, Mason said, checking his phone, I should call Deputy Collins and check on Daisy. The update from the ranch was positive. Daisy was resting comfortably, her physical injuries from the Anaconda attack painful but not life-threatening. More remarkably, the herd had maintained its protective formation around the barn where she was recovering, taking shifts so that several cattle were always standing guard near the structure. Never seen anything like it, Collins reported. They rotate every few hours like they've got a schedule, and they won't let Tucker's truck pass the main road. Every time he drives by, that big bull of yours positions himself at the fence line. Mason relayed this information to Sarah, who nodded as if it confirmed something she'd long suspected. They're taking care of her while she can't be with her calf. That's what a family does. As the adrenaline of the morning's events finally began to ebb, the full weight of their situation settled on Mason's shoulders. They had saved Daisy and hopefully her calf, but the larger threat remained. Tucker had been thwarted today, but his determination to acquire the Williams Ranch hadn't diminished. If anything, the public confrontation had likely hardened his resolve. What happens now? He asked quietly. Sarah's face showed the same weariness he felt, but beneath it was a steely determination he recognized from their shared past. Now we fight, not just for Daisy and her calf, but for all of them. Tucker needs to learn that some things aren't for sale. Mason nodded slowly, the pieces of his own resolve clicking into place. No matter what it takes, he agreed. And in that moment, it felt like a vow. Outside the hospital windows, the Montana morning had bloomed into full daylight, the Bridger Mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Somewhere back at the ranch, an extraordinary herd of cattle was demonstrating loyalty and intelligence that defied conventional understanding. And here, in this sterile waiting room, two people who had once saved lives in a war zone were committing themselves to a different kind of battle, one for recognition of the complex inner lives of beings too often reduced to commodities. It was a turning point, Mason realized, not just for Daisy and her calf or for Sarah's ranch, but for his own understanding of what it meant to protect and serve not just humans, but all the sentient beings under his care. While the premature calf fought for life in Bozeman's veterinary hospital, events at the Williams Ranch took an unexpected turn. Mason's phone rang shortly after noon, Deputy Collins's voice tight with urgency. You need to get back here, Crawford. Fish and Wildlife just raided Tucker's exotic animal facility. They found a lot more than just snakes. Mason glanced at Sarah, who was dozing in an uncomfortable waiting room chair after the exhausting morning. How bad? Bad enough that the FBI's been called in. Endangered species trafficking. And there's something else, documents showing Tucker's been trying to sabotage the Williams place for months. Detailed plans, payments to hands for special projects. It's all here. A cold satisfaction settled in Mason's chest. We'll head back as soon as we get an update on the calf. What about Daisy? Doing better than expected. That herd of hers is something else, Mason. They've been taking turns bringing her hay, dragging it right to the barn door. Old Doc Peterson came by to check her and said he's never seen anything like it in 50 years of large animal practice. After ending the call, Mason gently woke Sarah and shared the news. Her expression shifted from groggy confusion to shocked vindication. "They found actual documentation?" she asked, sitting up straighter. "Tucker's too careful for that." "Apparently not careful enough. Collins says they're going through financial records now looking for evidence of wildlife trafficking. The Anaconda was just the tip of the iceberg." Sarah leaned back, processing this development. All these months, the accidents, the pressure to sell. I was starting to doubt myself, wondering if I was just being paranoid, seeing patterns that weren't there. Mason understood that feeling all too well. After returning from Afghanistan, he'd struggled with hypervigilance, seeing threats in ordinary situations, but this time the danger had been real. "You weren't imagining things," he assured her. "Tucker was playing a long game, trying to drive you out without leaving evidence." Before they could discuss further, Dr. Chen appeared with another update. Her expression was cautiously optimistic as she approached. "The calf is showing improvement," she reported. "His oxygen levels have stabilized and he's beginning to breathe more on his own. We're still supporting him with the ventilator, but he's fighting." "Can we see him?" Sarah asked. Dr. Chen nodded. "Briefly. We've got him in isolation to prevent infection, but I can take you to the viewing window." They followed her through the hospital's winding corridors to the neonatal intensive care unit. Through a large window, they could see the tiny calf looking impossibly fragile amid the medical equipment. Tubes and monitors surrounded the small brown body, but even from a distance they could see the determined movement of his chest and the occasional flick of an ear. "He's so small," Mason observed, his voice hushed. "About 60 pounds, Dr. Chen confirmed. Full term would have been closer to 90. But he's got a strong heart and good bloodlines. Those count for a lot." Sarah pressed her hand against the glass as if trying to reach across the distance to her animal. "Does he have a chance?" "A fighting one," the doctor replied honestly. "The next 24 hours are critical. But if he makes it through the night, his odds improve significantly. We're giving him colostrum from our bank, but nothing beats mother's milk for antibodies." "If he stabilizes enough, could we bring his mother here?" Mason asked. Dr. Chen considered this. "It's unconventional, but not impossible. We have isolation stalls for large animals. If the calf is strong enough tomorrow, we could discuss it." After spending a few more minutes watching the struggling newborn, they reluctantly prepared to return to the ranch. The situation with Tucker required their attention, and Daisy needed Sarah's care for her own injuries. "I'll call every 2 hours for updates," Sarah told Dr. Chen. "And I can be back here within the hour if anything changes." The doctor nodded. "We'll take good care of him. He's quite the celebrity among our students already. We don't get many emergency cesarean deliveries involving Anaconda attacks." The drive back to Paradise Valley was tense, but hopeful. As they crested the final mountain pass that would lead them home, Sarah broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about what we saw today, with the herd," she said. "Their behavior goes beyond anything documented in agricultural research." Mason nodded, recalling the organized protection, the apparent communication, the obvious concern for Daisy's well-being. It was like watching a family, not just animals. "Exactly. They've always been unusually bonded. I selected for docile, social temperaments when building the herd. But this level of cooperation and problem-solving," she shook her head in wonder, "it challenges everything we think we know about bovine cognition." "Tucker called them dangerous," Mason recalled, "but they never threatened us, only him and his men." "They can distinguish between threats and allies," Sarah agreed. "That's sophisticated cognitive processing. They recognized you from the beginning as someone who helped Daisy before. The implications stretched beyond a single extraordinary herd in Montana. If cattle could demonstrate this level of emotional intelligence and social cooperation, what did that mean for agricultural practices nationwide? For the ethical frameworks that treated livestock as commodities rather than sentient beings? As they approached the Williams Ranch, they found a flurry of official vehicles lining the driveway. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs, a fish and wildlife truck, and an unmarked sedan that Mason recognized as FBI issue. Several officers were gathered near the barn, while others appeared to be documenting the broken fence where Big Red had charged through. Deputy Collins met them as they parked. "Perfect timing. The FBI agent wants statements from both of you about the Anaconda incident and Tucker's prior threatening behavior." "How's Daisy?" Sarah asked immediately. "Stable. Old Doc Peterson gave her antibiotics and pain medication. Said her ribs are bruised but not broken, which is a minor miracle considering how long that snake had her." They followed Collins to the barn, where Daisy was resting comfortably in a large stall. The cow raised her head when Sarah entered, letting out a soft moo of recognition. Sarah immediately went to her, examining the bandages and checking her vital signs. "She's looking for her calf," Sarah observed sadly, noting how Daisy kept glancing toward the barn door. "She doesn't understand where he is." Mason knelt beside the cow, stroking her neck gently. "He's fighting, Daisy, just like you did." Outside the stall, an FBI agent waited patiently to take their statements. Agent Rebecca Harlow was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with short-cropped hair and the efficient demeanor of someone who didn't waste time or words. "I understand you've had quite a morning," she began, notepad ready. "Let's start from the beginning." Over the next hour, Mason and Sarah recounted everything, from discovering Daisy trapped by the Anaconda to Tucker's thinly veiled threats and the remarkable behavior of the herd. Agent Harlow took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but otherwise allowing them to tell their story uninterrupted. "And you're certain the snake had a brand matching Tucker's exotic animal collection?" she asked when they finished. "Absolutely," Mason confirmed. "I've heard rumors about his collection for months but never had probable cause for a thorough inspection." Harlow nodded. "Well, now we have more than cause." The search of his facility uncovered over 30 endangered species being kept illegally, including 6 more anacondas with the same branding mark. But that's not the most interesting part. She pulled out her phone, showing them photographs of documents recovered during the raid. "Tucker kept meticulous records of his efforts to drive you out, Ms. Williams. Payments to hands for cutting fences, contaminating water sources, even introducing parasites to weaken your cattle. And this," she swiped to another image, "is a detailed plan for releasing the anaconda specifically where your pregnant cow grazed." Sarah's face paled. "He deliberately targeted Daisy? Why her specifically?" "According to these notes, she's the genetic cornerstone of your breeding program. Tucker believed if she was eliminated, your herd's value would decrease significantly, making you more likely to sell." The calculated cruelty of it struck Mason like a physical blow. To deliberately target an animal not just for its economic value, but specifically because of its importance to Sarah and the herd, that revealed a vindictiveness that went beyond business competition. "Will these charges stick?" he asked. Harlow's expression was grimly satisfied. "The wildlife trafficking alone carries significant federal penalties. Combined with criminal endangerment, conspiracy, and destruction of property, Mr. Tucker is facing serious prison time." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the barn doors, they could see Tucker himself being led to a sheriff's vehicle in handcuffs, his face a mask of outrage. His attorney followed, frantically speaking into a cell phone. "He doesn't look happy," Mason observed. "He's been refused bail as a flight risk," Harlow explained. Judge Harmon was particularly disturbed by the premeditated nature of the attacks on your livestock. While this development should have brought relief, Mason found himself watching Tucker with a sense of unease. Men like him, wealthy, connected, accustomed to power, rarely went down without a fight. The handcuffs seemed almost incongruous on Tucker's wrists, like the universe had temporarily inverted itself. As if sensing his thoughts, Harlow added, "We've frozen his assets pending investigation. His ranch hands are being questioned individually. Several have already turned on him, hoping for leniency." Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, her focus on Daisy, but now she looked up. "What about his exotic animals?" "Wildlife authorities are coordinating their removal to appropriate sanctuaries," Harlow assured her. "None will be euthanized unless absolutely necessary for public safety or their own welfare." This seemed to satisfy Sarah, who returned to gently examining Daisy's injuries. The cow had remained calm throughout the conversation, her large brown eyes occasionally finding Mason's face as if seeking reassurance. "She's asking about her calf," Sarah said softly. "I can see it in her eyes." Mason knelt beside the cow again. "We're going to bring him home to you," he promised, feeling only slightly foolish speaking directly to the animal. After what he'd witnessed today, it seemed disrespectful not to acknowledge her understanding. As the afternoon progressed, the official presence gradually diminished. The FBI and Fish and Wildlife teams departed, leaving only a sheriff's deputy stationed at the property as a precaution. Mason and Sarah found themselves alone in the gathering dusk, the weight of the day's events settling around them like the evening mist on the mountains. They sat on the porch of the main house, mugs of coffee warming their hands against the cooling air. The herd had gathered in the nearest pasture, their forms dark silhouettes against the purpling sky. Even from a distance, Mason could make out Big Red's distinctive profile, the massive bull standing watch at the perimeter. "I called the hospital while you were giving your statement," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The calf is still holding his own. His oxygen levels are improving." Mason felt a surge of relief. "That's good news. They think if he continues improving overnight, we might be able to transport Daisy to Bozeman tomorrow. Having her there could make all the difference for him." The prospect of reuniting mother and calf brought a sense of rightness, of balance being restored. But larger questions still lingered between them. "What happens now?" Mason asked, echoing his earlier question from the hospital waiting room. Sarah gazed out at her land, at the herd that had demonstrated such extraordinary loyalty and intelligence. "Now we tell their story," she said simply. "What we witnessed today shouldn't be hidden away or dismissed. The world needs to know that these animals are more than just production units." "People might not believe it," he cautioned. "Or they might not want to believe it because of what it means for how we treat livestock." "Then we'll show them," she replied with quiet determination. "We'll document the herd's behavior, invite researchers, gather evidence. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere." As darkness fell completely, their phones rang simultaneously, Dr. Chen calling with an update that made both their hearts skip a beat. "The calf is trying to stand," she reported, her voice reflecting her own amazement. "It's incredible. At this gestational age, with the trauma he's experienced, he shouldn't have the strength, but he's trying anyway." "His mother's son," Sarah said, a catch in her voice. "We've named him Fighter in our records," Dr. Chen continued. "Unless you'd prefer something else?" Sarah glanced at Mason, a question in her eyes. He nodded, understanding the significance of the moment, of being asked to help name this remarkable survivor. "Fighter is perfect," Sarah told the doctor. "It's exactly who he is." After ending the call, they sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this new spark of hope. The ranch around them seemed to hold its breath in the darkness, the stars emerging one by one overhead, ancient and indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. But in the pasture, the herd remained vigilant, their silent presence a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections emerge from the most unexpected places, and that loyalty, once given, transcends the boundaries we too often draw between species. 1 month later, Mason stood at the fence line of the Williams Ranch's south pasture, watching the remarkable scene unfolding before him. Daisy grazed contentedly in the lush spring grass, her coat gleaming with health in the morning sunlight. Beside her, Fighter frolicked on gangly legs that seemed to grow longer by the day, occasionally butting playfully against his mother's side or racing in joyful circles around the other cattle. It was hard to reconcile this vibrant young calf with the fragile creature they'd rushed to Bozeman's veterinary hospital 4 weeks earlier. Fighter had defied every medical expectation, not only surviving his premature birth, but thriving under the combined care of the veterinary team and his attentive mother. The specialists still called him their miracle calf, documenting his remarkable recovery for veterinary journals. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, joining Mason at the fence. She handed him a mug of coffee, steam rising in the crisp Montana air. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied, nodding toward Fighter. 4 weeks ago, I wasn't sure he'd make it through the night." Sarah smiled. The lines of stress that had marked her face a month ago now softened. "He gets his stubbornness from his mama. And his name wasn't just wishful thinking. He really is a fighter." The journey back from the brink had been arduous. After that first night of uncertainty, Fighter had improved enough for them to transport Daisy to Bozeman, an operation that had required careful planning and the assistance of Dr. Peterson. The reunion between mother and calf had brought tears to the eyes of even the most seasoned veterinary staff. Daisy's gentle lowing when she first saw her offspring, the way she'd immediately positioned herself protectively beside his incubator, refusing to leave even when offered food or water. For 5 days, they'd remained at the hospital, Daisy standing vigil while Fighter gradually gained strength. The research team had documented the remarkable healing effect of the mother's presence. The calf's vital signs improved measurably whenever Daisy was near, his oxygen levels stabilizing, his will to live visibly strengthening. "Did you see the article in the journal?" Sarah asked, interrupting Mason's reminiscence. "They're calling it maternal proximity therapy, suggesting that keeping mothers and offspring together during medical treatment significantly improves outcomes." Mason chuckled. "Imagine that. Centuries of evolution making mothers important to their babies, and modern medicine just figuring it out." "Better late than never," Sarah replied. "The research team wants to come back next week, by the way, Doctor." Abernathy is expanding his study on bovine cognition and social structures. The Williams herd had become something of a scientific sensation in the weeks following the Anaconda incident. When video of their protective behavior had circulated among researchers, a team from Colorado State University had arrived to document the unprecedented cooperation and apparent problem-solving abilities displayed by the cattle. What began as skeptical curiosity had quickly evolved into serious academic interest. "Big Red still giving them a hard time?" Mason asked, grinning at the memory of the massive bull deliberately positioning himself between the researchers and certain members of the herd, clearly establishing boundaries for the human observers. "He's warming up to them," Sarah laughed, "especially since they started bringing those molasses treats he loves. That bull would do just about anything for blackstrap molasses." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a white SUV coming up the long driveway, Montana fish and wildlife markings on its doors. Mason recognized Randy Blackburn, the regional director who had overseen the investigation into Tucker's exotic animal trafficking. "Morning, folks," Blackburn called as he climbed out of his vehicle. A solidly built man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, he'd been instrumental in building the case against Tucker. "Thought you'd want an update in person." They invited him onto the porch where Sarah poured another mug of coffee. Blackburn accepted it gratefully, warming his hands around the ceramic. "Tucker's case is proceeding," he began without preamble. "Federal prosecutors have added new charges based on evidence we found during a second search of his property. Looks like he's been importing endangered species for at least 5 years, selling to private collectors across 3 states. "What kind of sentence is he looking at?" Mason asked. "Minimum 10 years, according to the prosecutor. His attorney's still trying to negotiate a plea deal, but with the evidence we've got, including his own meticulous records, they don't have much leverage." Blackburn shook his head ruefully. "Never understood why criminals keep such detailed notes on their illegal activities. Makes our job a whole lot easier." Sarah's expression remained serious despite the good news. "What about his ranch? There are still cattle and horses there that need care." "His sister's taken over operations for now," Blackburn assured her. "From what I hear, she's been trying to rein in his worst impulses for years. She's already reached out to neighboring ranchers about cooperative grazing agreements, a very different approach from her brother's." This was welcome news. Tucker's sister Catherine was known in the valley as the more reasonable sibling, someone who understood the value of community cooperation in ranching country. Where Hank had sought dominance and expansion at any cost, Catherine favored sustainable practices in maintaining good relationships with neighboring properties. "There's something else," Blackburn continued, his expression lightening. "The university research team studying your herd has approached the department about establishing a permanent research station here. They're proposing a joint venture, studying both wild animal behavior in the surrounding wilderness and the remarkable social structures your cattle have developed." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Here? On the ranch?" "If you're amenable," Blackburn nodded. "It would come with grant funding, of course, enough to build proper facilities and hire additional staff. They're calling it the Williams Ranch Initiative for Cognitive and Behavioral Research." The potential of such a partnership wasn't lost on Mason. Beyond the financial benefits for Sarah's struggling operation, it would provide scientific validation for what they'd witnessed. Evidence that domestic animals possessed far greater cognitive abilities and emotional lives than conventional agriculture acknowledged. "I'd want assurances that the research wouldn't disrupt the herd," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Their welfare comes first." "Absolutely," Blackburn agreed. "The proposal emphasizes observation rather than intervention." Dr. Abernathy was quite clear that the unique behaviors they're studying depend on the herd remaining unstressed and in their natural social groupings. As they discussed the details of the research proposal, Mason's attention drifted back to the pasture where Fighter was now resting beside his mother, the morning sun warming their brown coats. Around them, the herd maintained the same protective formation they'd demonstrated since the calf's return from the hospital, creating a living boundary between the vulnerable pair and the wider world. Big Red stood at the perimeter, his massive head raised, alert to any potential threats. The bull's vigilance had not wavered in the weeks since the Anaconda attack. As if he understood his role as the herd's protector had taken on new importance. Mason had observed him actively teaching younger bulls this protective behavior, modeling the strategic positioning that had so amazed the researchers. When Blackburn departed, promising to send the formal research proposal by the end of the week, Sarah joined Mason at the fence line again. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the peaceful scene before them. "I've been thinking," Sarah said finally. "About what you said that day at the hospital, about fighting for all of them, not just Daisy and Fighter." Mason nodded, remembering the fierce commitment they'd made in that moment of crisis. "This research partnership could be the beginning of something bigger," she continued. "If we can demonstrate scientifically what we already know, that these animals have complex emotional lives, that they form deep bonds and understand far more than we've given them credit for. It could change how people think about livestock everywhere. It won't be easy, Mason cautioned. There's a lot of economic interest in maintaining the status quo. The best fights never are, Sarah replied with a small smile. But if not us, then who? We've been given this opportunity to witness something extraordinary. I think we have an obligation to share it with the world. Her words resonated with the sense of purpose that had been growing in Mason since that fateful morning by the marsh. His role as a wildlife ranger had always been about protection, preserving natural spaces, enforcing regulations, ensuring balance between human needs and environmental health. But the events of the past month had expanded his understanding of what truly deserved protection. "I've been offered a new position," he said suddenly. "Fish and Wildlife wants me to head up a new division focusing on animal welfare across both wild and domestic species. Blackburn mentioned it last week." Sarah turned to him, surprise and pride mingling in her expression. "That's wonderful, Mason. You'd be perfect for it." "I haven't accepted yet," he admitted. "It would mean more time in Helena, less time here in the valley, less time at the ranch." The unspoken question hung between them, as tangible as the morning mist that still clung to the distant mountains. In the weeks since the Anaconda incident, Mason had found himself spending most of his off-duty hours at the Williams Ranch, helping with repairs, assisting with the herd, or simply sitting with Sarah on the porch, talking until the stars emerged overhead. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "I'm going to need a partner if this research station becomes reality. Someone who understands both wildlife management and ranch operations. Someone the herd already trusts." Mason felt something expand in his chest. Hope, possibility, a future taking shape. "Are you offering me a job, Dr. Williams?" "I'm offering you a partnership," she corrected gently. "In whatever form you want that to take." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the boundaries between them, professional, personal, emotional, seemed as artificial as the fences that supposedly contained the remarkable beings grazing peacefully before them. Before Mason could respond, a soft lowing drew their attention back to the pasture. Fighter had approached the fence line, his curious eyes fixed on them. Behind him, Daisy watched attentively, while Big Red and several other cattle moved closer, creating their now familiar protective semicircle. "I think they're weighing in on the decision," Mason said with a smile, reaching out to let Fighter sniff his hand through the fence. The calf's wet nose nudged against his palm with surprising gentleness, the touch a reminder of the extraordinary bond that had formed between human and animal. In Fighter's intelligent eyes, Mason saw not just the miracle of survival, but the promise of a new beginning, for the calf, for the herd, for himself and Sarah, and perhaps for the larger relationship between humans and the beings with whom they shared the planet. "In this neck of the woods, we look after our own," Sarah said softly, using the old Montana saying that had been passed down through generations of ranching families. Mason covered her hand with his, their fingers intertwining as naturally as the streams that fed the valley's verdant pastures. "Yes, we do." As the morning sun climbed higher over Paradise Valley, casting its golden light across the landscape, Mason Crawford felt a sense of homecoming deeper than any he'd known since returning from war. Here, among these remarkable animals and this equally remarkable woman, he had found not just purpose, but belonging. A place where the artificial boundaries between species fell away, revealing the profound connections that had always existed for those willing to see them. "I accept," he said simply, turning to face Sarah fully. "The partnership. All of it." Her smile was like the breaking of dawn, illuminating everything it touched. Good. Because I don't think they would have let you leave anyway. She nodded toward the herd, where Fighter had been joined by several other cattle at the fence line, their curious faces turned toward the humans as if following the conversation with interest. Mason laughed, the sound echoing across the peaceful valley. Well, I've learned my lesson about arguing with this family, especially when Big Red has an opinion. As if on cue, the massive bull raised his head and let out a sonorous bellow that seemed to seal the agreement. Sarah's laughter joined Mason's, the joyful sound blending with the chorus of lowing cattle and the gentle rustling of spring leaves. In that perfect moment, under the vast Montana sky, the artificial lines that humans drew between themselves and other beings, between wild and domestic, between emotional and instinctual, between family and property, dissolved into something older and truer, the recognition of kindred spirits regardless of form. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Sarah murmured, echoing another old saying that had sustained generations through the valley's harsh winters and bountiful summers. "And sometimes," Mason added, gazing at Fighter standing strong beside his mother, at the protective herd that had demonstrated such extraordinary loyalty and intelligence, "those mysteries are right in front of us all along. We just need to open our eyes and truly see." Dear friends, have you ever witnessed something that made you believe in the goodness of this world again? That's what Mason and Sarah discovered on that fateful Montana morning. Not just the incredible intelligence of animals we've taken for granted, but the power of loyalty that transcends species. Like Mason, many of us have experienced life's hardest challenges, perhaps returning from service or facing loss, wondering if we'll ever truly find home again. This story reminds us that healing often comes in unexpected packages, sometimes in the watchful eyes of a mother cow protecting her calf, or in the courage of a premature newborn fighting against all odds. In our twilight years, when we might question what truly matters, isn't it beautiful to be reminded that connection, loyalty, and standing up for what's right never go out of style? The simple wisdom that, in this neck of the woods we look after our own, speaks to the America many of us remember and cherish. What unexpected relationship has brought healing to your life? When was the last time you witnessed loyalty that restored your faith? Please share your stories in the comments below. We're all richer when we share our experiences with one another.